Hello apes and welcome to screencast number 3 in the chapter 3 Evolution, Biodiversity and Population Ecology. And in this section we're going to start off talking about artificial selection. And when we talk about natural selection that just happens randomly in nature, artificial selection is the process that's actually conducted under human direction. This is where we've gotten a lot of our dog breeds from, is we've followed the breeds that we liked, and we pick the ones that we see as being the favorable traits, and we make sure that those breeds breed together so that they produce the most favorable. And this is what you see at the competitions, the dog shows. My brother breeds Samoyed Huskies, and he looks for certain features when he mates his Husky, his Samoyed, to make sure that they are getting the traits that he wants them to have. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So when we looked at our dog breeds actually came from the wolf. And through breeding different characteristics of the wolf, we got the St. Bernard, the Chihuahua, and that's kind of where my little chuckle came from because they're so tiny in comparison to these other dogs, the Great Dane and the Collie. And you can see some similarities here, like mostly in the fur, but a change in the snout where you see relationships here, which kind of give you the idea that we selected characteristics that we liked and we breeded them from there. And the same thing can happen with our crops, our food. We actually got cabbage from this weed-like looking plant here, and they developed into Brussels sprouts, which I don't really like, cauliflower, and broccoli as well. So that's another way that we get our crops. We pick out favorable characteristics and we breed them. Now we're faced with GMOs today, and that's a whole nother chapter. Okay, so biological diversity was coined by a man by the name of Raven, and he put it together and called it biodiversity, which is the variety of life across all levels of biological organization. So this includes species diversity, genetic diversity, population diversity, and community diversity. So all of that is held within that concept of biodiversity. And scientists feel like we have identified about 1.8 million different species that we've been able to actually find, discover, and see. But they estimate that there's about 3 million to maybe 100 million of species that we haven't identified yet. And that's because we just either haven't discovered them or we don't have the technology to discover them. We know how tiny cells are, and we need a microscope in order to help us look at cells. So maybe we just don't have the technology to see the other life forms. We just within the past 10-15 years discovered that there's enormous life around these sea vents that are so deep and dark that we never even thought life could exist there. And we're finding all sorts of chemosynthetic organisms and anglerfish, like you saw in Finding Nemo, that live in these dark places. So when we think of, well, where do we find biodiversity? Biodiversity is just everywhere. It's throughout everything. The process of generating new species from a single species is something called allopatric speciation, and this is how we can form new species due to physical separation of populations. The whole idea is that excuse me, this is a mechanism of speciation that we're talking about. So to be a little bit more clear on what speciation is, this is the process where we get new species that are generated. It's just another way of saying. So let's take a look at this a little bit further. Speciation can occur in a number of ways, but the main model that we're going to talk about is the allopatric speciation. And this is where species form from populations that become physically separated over some geographic distance. The individuals within the population will possess many of the similarities that unify them as a species because they were able to breed with one another and share genetic information, but the population gets broken up into two or more isolated areas, and then the individuals from the one area, because they've had to adapt and adjust, can no longer reproduce with the individuals from another area. So that's what the allopatric speciation is. It's the main mode of speciations. They can be separated by glaciers or rivers or mountains, and because they have to adapt to the new areas that they're living in, they get their own set of mutations that do not enable them to be able to reproduce, and it actually speeds up this process of natural selection. So here is a diagram that is in your textbook on page 53, and it shows that, you know, this is not an immediate process, that it's going to be a long, slow process, especially when the different types of geographic barriers, as you can see depicted in here, happen. So when we're taking a look at number one is the indicator of just a single species, a single population, and in this area it's a forest, and if it's destroyed by lava flow like we see in number 2, then it's going to separate these two species. And because it's separated, it isolates it in patches that these organisms then will have to depend on different means for survival if they didn't get the same components that they had from that single population. So when we think about Hawaii and we think about the birds in Hawaii, this could have been something that happened as the islands were forming that forced them into other sections. So we're looking at fruit flies right here, and fruit flies are very weak flyers. They can become very isolated so that they can live only in one specific area. And over the centuries, we see that the populations have accumulated their own independent set of genetic changes. So notice that in this area that their resources are kind of yellow in color, so that species is kind of yellow, and their resources here are red in color, and that adapted to be red in color. So these isolated populations then that we see in the fourth one, they eventually become so genetically distinct that they're unable to breed, and they wind up developing this new species. And as we can see here, as the forest maybe fills in because of succession and the new grows over, then maybe that can even create another species that might intermix. We might have an unusual rare red species that could possibly mate again with the yellow species because the changes weren't complete, and now we could have a mixed orange species, if that makes any sense to you. Okay? So we can infer that the history of life's diversification happened by comparing the organisms. One of the ways that we can do this is looking at something called phylogenetic trees. And we're going to see a picture of that. Well, let's go to the next screen so that we can see this. So this is a phylogenetic tree that you're seeing here. And this actually shows the history of divergence by using kind of like this branching method that we see here. And these diagrams illustrate to scientists the hypothesis of how divergence took place, how these adaptations and evolution occurred. The phylogenetic trees can also show relationships among the species and groups of species, populations, or genes, so we can adjust them to that. They construct these trees by analyzing the patterns of similarity among the genes, maybe even take a look at their external traits and their present-day organisms, and they infer which groups are going to share similarities because they are related. So taking a look at this phylogenetic tree, this illustrates the relationship among vertebrates that we're seeing, so organisms with a backbone, and just one small portion of a huge complex tree of life. So we're not seeing anything else but this. But each branch results from a speciation event. So as you follow along the tree from left to right from its trunk, you're seeing the tips of its branches in the organisms, and as you proceed forward in time and you trace life's history, you can see how the changes in major traits wind up being mapped out. Who would have thought that crocodiles and birds would have any relationship? We can see that snakes and lizards and crocodiles might have a relationship, but that kind of, the feathers are a barrier that we're not too sure about. There's even that possibility that turtles could have come in here, and we take a look at, their skulls and the similarities in their skulls. So this shows the different relationships that could exist. For instance, if we looked at all the vertebrates to the right of the hash mark, indicating the origin of jaws, where they possess jaws, or whereas lampreys diverged before jaws originated and lacked them, this is an example of how we can show these relationships. Okay, this is not one of the ones I'm crazy about, but it is a way that we're looking to show this divergence. Okay, we can infer also based on the diversification and comparing organisms. If we know how organisms are related to one another, this is going to help scientists to organize them. And we put them into different categories that actually reflect the relationships. So scientists will actually use the physical characteristics and the genetic characteristics to put them into different groupings. And as we know, species will get a two-part Latinized scientific name, a genus and a species, that will identify them and will be the universal name for them. So here is our classification system. Now, when I started learning this, it was just kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That was the order, and we remembered it by saying King Philip came over from Germany swimming. That's the way that we remembered it. But now we have a new area, and this is the domain Eukarya, because all of these organisms are eukaryotic in their cell structure. So we can now classify them as a whole different grouping, where the prokaryotes are going to be without a nucleus and not these complex cell structures. All right, we're going to stop there, and we will go into our next screencast. See you in a few.